All right, we are in week number 103 in our series from the Beloved. We're in John chapter 18 today. If you've been with us, John 17, Jesus is praying for his disciples, praying for himself as he prepares for the cross. Then we moved into John 18 and the arrest of Jesus. And last week, Jesus was entering the courts or the house of Annas and Caiaphas. But before we get into what comes next, I want to highlight just a couple of things again, just bring these things back to our minds. Is first of all, that throughout Jesus' ministry, John has presented Jesus as firmly in control of what takes place around him. Jesus is not a pawn in redemptive history. He is the prime actor. This is not only true of the Passion narrative, though it is especially seen in the Passion narrative, but we've seen it throughout Jesus' ministry. If you look for a second, I want to just kind of remember something together. Go to John chapter 6 for just a moment, if you will. John chapter 6. We see Jesus has fed the multitudes of people, and as after he's fed the multitudes of people, he sends his disciples across the Sea of Galilee. And in verse 19, Jesus decides he is going to join them. He's not in the boat with them. He decides he's going to join them. It says that when the disciples, had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat and were frightened, but he said to them, "It is I." Anyone want to care to guess what the actual translation is there? Ego eimi, I am. It's actually, those are the words he says there. It is I, do not be afraid. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So in this moment, Jesus is in control. He's in control of the feeding of the multitudes. He's in control of when the disciples go and when he decides to join them. Even the waves and the sea are not going to stop him from doing what he is called to do at the time that he's called to do it. This same control, again associated with the divine name, the name I am, that ego eimi, that same control is exhibited in the Garden of Gethsemane. You'll remember the arresting officials come to Jesus. Jesus asks the question, "Whom do you seek?" And what is their response? What do the arresting officials respond? Who are they looking for? Jesus of Nazareth, his very human name from his human location, and Jesus responds, "I am." And they immediately kind of recoil and they fall to the ground. There's no point at Jesus' ministry, even up till his arrest and crucifixion, that Jesus is not totally in control and in power of what is going on. At the same time, Jesus uses this power not for his own sake, but for the sake of the mission on which he has been sent by the Father. Remember, he demonstrates his acts of service to his disciples by washing their feet in John chapter 13. He gives words to these actions in the synoptic gospels. He came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The service of Jesus is in keeping with his commitment to the mission and the submission of the will of the Father. He does the will of the Father, and that is manifested in his love of his disciples and in the sacrifice that he displays on the cross. It's the commitment to the mission of the Father that compels Jesus to the Garden of Gethsemane in the first place. Why does Jesus go to the Garden of Gethsemane? Why does he go there? Why does he actually go there? He goes there and he prays. But why does he go to the Garden of Gethsemane? He knew Judas was going to go there. Jesus went to the garden to be arrested. He knew if Jesus wasn't in submission to the will of the Father, if Jesus wasn't committed to the mission that he was sent on, he would have avoided the Garden of Gethsemane because he is in control. He is absolutely in control 100% of the time. So when he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, it is in demonstration of his control and his commitment to the mission. So that's why he goes there. It's interesting that Jesus asks for the protection of his disciples, and then what does Peter do? Peter goes and strikes the ear of the servant Malchus, the high priest's servant Malchus, trying to protect Jesus, and he does it in a very ill-timed and ill-effective way, and Jesus again has to protect his disciples. But that is part of the commitment to the mission, because Jesus has said not one that has been given to him has been lost except for Judas. Okay, so what happens here? Jesus is arrested. Jesus is taken to the house of Annas and Caiaphas. We talked about this last week. Who are Annas and Caiaphas? Who's Caiaphas in the first place? The high priest, according to the Romans. Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that most of the Jews recognize, who was deposed by the Roman government. The Roman government thought he was too powerful. They thought he was too whatever, and they said he cannot be the high priest anymore. And yet he still holds all the cards. He still has the respect of the Jewish people. So they take him to the house of the high priest and Annas and Caiaphas. So when you see that in a few moments when the high priest is interrogating Jesus, it's important to understand that it's Annas first, Caiaphas second. Okay, that's kind of the order of what we're doing here. So then we kind of get the onrushing of the disciples here, or not onrushing, but the influx of the disciples' influence. So that's where we're picking up today. John chapter 18, verse 15 is where we're picking up today. Simon Peter, it says, followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter stood outside of the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. Now, from last week, we know that Jesus had been arrested by two sets of arresting officials, right? It was the Roman guards. There was a contingent of Roman guards and a contingent of the temple guards. Maybe all of the temple guards. We're not really sure. It doesn't give us an idea. And they take Jesus to Annas and Caiaphas for the first stage of a religious interrogation. Now, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a moment, but at this point, we shift the scene from Annas and Caiaphas to Peter, Simon Peter, and another disciple. Now, you know, if you know the story, that this sets the stage for Peter's denial, which we'll get to in a moment. And all four Gospels relate Peter's denial. It's not just that Peter disowned Jesus that's a problem. It's that he did so as an intimate friend. It's not just anybody who happened to be kind of a lot of people disown Jesus. You have to remember, there were points in Jesus' ministry where there were thousands following him. Thousands of people screamed and cried out, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." At Jesus' death, how many of them are around? Very few. So lots of people disown Jesus. But the fact that it's Peter, it's a big deal. But it also highlights the advanced knowledge that Jesus has. Remember, Jesus predicts Peter's denial, and again, his control over the events that are to take place. It also demonstrates the isolating effect of Jesus' humiliation. Jesus is not just arrested, he's not only tortured, he's not only crucified, but he does so virtually alone, isolated from those who are closest to him. Yeah, Marilyn. Well, we'll get into that I would say a couple of weeks, but it's more like a couple of months, more than likely. But just as a preview of that, because that's like a chapter and a half away. Jesus may be back by then. Who knows? More than likely, I think what we're gonna get to is the effect of mob mentality and the effect of bribery by the high priests and the Sanhedrin. So we're gonna see that. We have to think about this for a second too. Jesus was not the only one claiming messiahship throughout the history of the Jewish people in the first century. There were a lot, I won't say a lot, there were at least a half dozen that we know of that said they were the Messiah, or other people said they were the Messiah. So it wouldn't be uncommon for some people to say, well, that's the guy I'm going to hitch my wagon to. Oh, wait, he's arrested. He obviously can't be it anymore. And if he's not the Messiah, then he's a blasphemer. So we'll get to that, though, assuming Jesus doesn't come back. But one of the questions that I want to dig at for just a second is Peter and the other disciple. Now, at first blush, it seems obvious who's the other disciple. John. It seems obvious that it's the beloved disciple who's mentioned in John 13 and later in John 20 and 21 because he's unnamed. He's an unnamed disciple who is in close proximity to both Jesus and Peter. So who is the only unnamed disciple who is in both close proximity to Jesus and Peter? That's John. That's why the whole name of this series is from the beloved. It's from the beloved disciple. However, there are some scholars who question the traditional assumption. That is the traditional assumption. And it really boils down to, how does John, what's John's occupation, by the way, before he meets Jesus? What is it? He's a fisherman. From where? Galilee. Galilee, close proximity or far proximity from Jerusalem? Not close. Close by our standards, but not close by first century standards. Not super, super close. How does, in the first century, a fisherman from Galilee have such close knowledge with the inner workings of the high priest? I'm talking the most powerful Jewish person in the whole world. How does that fisherman from Galilee gain access to the courtyard of Annas, the most powerful man amongst the Jewish people? That's a big question mark. Because we'll stop for a second, back up. If you don't remember, I said this last week. They're not at the Sanhedrin. They're not at the temple court. It's still illegal what they're doing, but this would be highly illegal and irregular for them to go to the temple court to do this. This is more than likely at the home of Annas. So we're talking about his personal home. How does a fisherman from Galilee gain access to the household of the highest, most important Jewish person in the nation? And in the middle of a very sensitive, mostly illegal proceeding. This is not like I'm just going to go to the house of an important person and I kind of know them. This is going to the house of an important person that you kind of know at a very sensitive moment, being able to gain incriminating evidence and being a disciple of the accused. So some scholars beg the question, how is that possible? So they conclude, based on those question marks, that it's not the beloved disciple, but it's in fact some other unnamed disciple who might have access, a Jerusalem disciple. We can name a couple, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, to name a few. However, again, this is a second however. You like how I'm doing this? Can I tell you where we're going to land? We're going to land on that it's John. At the same time, John's gospel has no trouble calling out the names of people like Nicodemus or Joseph of Arimathea, understanding that their social standing, understanding their social kind of where they're at in the social strata. And for us to, the scholars that deny the traditional mode, we're taking 20th and 21st century standards of hierarchy and applying it to first century Judaism. It doesn't bear any resemblance to one another. Yes, there were powerful people. Yes, there were less powerful people. But that does not, just because he's a fisherman from Galilee, that is us applying our standard of who should be in and who should be out based on someone's occupation and where they're from. That may not have any bearing in this case. John, if it is John, may be related to a servant in the household of Annas and Caiaphas. He might be a cousin of the servant girl that we're talking. We don't know. So it's a lot closer knit community than even like a city like Lakeland would be. We're talking about a much tighter knit community. And from a literary standpoint, again, John is the only one that goes unnamed in the Gospels, or it's obvious that he's going unnamed. He only calls himself the beloved disciple, or the other disciple, the disciple that Jesus loves. And the fact that this disciple also is intent on getting Peter into the courtyard, it bears more weight on the fact that John is the one in question. Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, some other kind of higher, more politically connected disciple would not necessarily be as concerned. Remember, it's not just proximity to Jesus that matters, it's proximity to Peter that also matters as well, too. Bob, you had a question? Yeah. Yes. Bob makes the point that John's family, his father, it was a business that they owned. It was not just a couple of brothers and a dad going out fishing for their daily fish. That was not all they were doing. They were a little bit of a big, it seems like from the evidence that they were a little bit of a bigger operation than just that. Maybe multitude of boats. Not necessarily wealthy, but more than just what we think of as poor fishermen. Uneducated, sure. Not access to not the people that a typical rabbi would recruit as disciples, but not necessarily poor and without standing. But again, we're applying our kind of our mentality about who gains access to what important place onto a first century Jewish situation. And none of us are first century Jews. None of us are Jewish that I know of, right? Nancy.
The emphasis, of course, is on Peter and his denial of Jesus. But if John is right there,
Yeah.
I think anybody who's John of being with Jesus or being one of his disciples, the same things they accuse Peter of.
That's a great question. Nancy asks, why doesn't John get some heat about denying Jesus? Because all evidence points to the fact that John didn't deny Jesus.
But nobody said anything to give him a reason to do it.
If, like it seems here, John intimately knows the people in the high priest's court, they wouldn't have to ask him because they would know the answer is already affirmative. Peter's unknown, John's known. And who's the only male disciple that's listed at the cross? John. So all evidence points to the fact that John didn't ever deny Jesus. Side note, who's the only disciple that isn't martyred? John. John's the only one that doesn't die a martyr. He dies in captivity. He dies in exile. Most historians believe he dies in his 90s, though. I mean, that's significant considering the fact all of his friends and generations to follow, they die martyrs, but John does not. Where are they? We talked about this just briefly. While Caiaphas is technically the high priest, the fact that Annas is mentioned and the previous kind of idea that he's the one that's really in charge, we must consider that Annas is the one that's acting in accordance. He's the one that's acting as judge here. It's not Caiaphas that's really in view yet. He becomes kind of in view in just a little bit. The fact that this is the case, it's Annas' home that is where Jesus is brought, and it's his servants that are the ones that do the questioning of Peter that we're going to see in just a moment. I don't want to belabor that anymore. Later in the Synoptic Gospels, we see more of a formal proceeding in front of the Sanhedrin, but really Annas is the one in his home, and that's in view here. Now, what John does is very interesting when he begins to talk about the ordeal of Jesus. He shifts the scene from inside with Jesus and Annas to outside with Peter and the high priest's servants. It's an interesting narrative choice because he could have just done everything chronologically and just focused on one scene. He could have just gone to the home of Annas and Caiaphas, had the interrogation of Jesus, done the whole thing, and then done a meanwhile outside, and then recorded all of Peter's actions. But he doesn't do that. He goes back and forth in an alternating fashion. And it affects our view of what's taking place. The cut of action shows us some things about what's happening to Jesus, both politically, both criminally, but also relationally. We get to see that at the same time, Jesus is being totally abandoned by those that are probably going to abandon him, the high priesthood and the Jewish religious leaders, but also those that are closest to him. And John does a very interesting thing in that moment. And so we go from inside, now we're outside, and we talk about the first denial of Peter. Verse 17. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the servant and the officers had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was with them, standing and warming himself. The servant girl, or the other disciple, has spoken to the very servant girl who addresses Peter. It's the servant girl who allows him entry, and at this point she asks him in a kind of a negative fashion, "Are you not also," she actually says, "You are not also one of this man's disciples?" ? You could also say, "Are you not also one of this man's disciples?" The "also," Nancy, to your point, indicates she knows this is an addition to John. So we know John's a disciple. Aren't you also? Aren't you also one of his disciples? If we assume that they are there, and that John is known as a disciple, it's not necessary for us to read this as a hostile question. Okay? She's simply asking. Because if she knows that John is one of the disciples, this is simply, "Are you also with him? Are you also with him?" Now, is it maybe a cynical statement because she's a servant of the high priest? Maybe, but it's not necessarily a conflict-laden question. Yeah, Robert.
Regardless of Peter's response, the very fact that he's there with Jesus and John is self-evident. How else would he know of the arrest? How else would he be with the group?
Yeah, it would seem that it's an obvious answer to a kind of a silly question, because it is late at night. John, we're going to talk about this in a second. John establishes that it's kind of an odd time of day. It's cold. Why would somebody be there that's not a disciple? However, remember, this is not really about what is necessary knowledge. It's about establishing a couple of things related to Jesus. One, that Jesus is in control and that he's being totally isolated. And two, he knew Peter was going to deny him, and this sets the stage for that. The servant girl, without her own knowledge, is just an is acting out what Jesus already knew was going to take place. We're not entirely sure how crowded the courtyard is at this point. If you remember, we talked about the size of the arresting contingent, hundreds of arresting soldiers on both Roman and temple side. It's very likely that the Roman soldiers are outside the temple, not temple, but outside the courtyard gates. In case there's a problem, they would probably not have entered, thus recognizing the control of the high priest. They probably would just stayed there and waited to be able to take the prisoner to the political side of the trial. So we're talking, it's an active scene. This is not just a few people milling about while things happen with Jesus. This is scores and scores, if not hundreds of people in and around the courtyard of Annas the high priest, Annas and Caiaphas. Okay? The question that gets brought to my mind every time I read this, and I've read this story from the Synoptics and John's Gospel tons of times. The question I always come back to is why. Now I know from a eternal God's perspective standpoint, the why is focused on Jesus and his mission. The total abandonment of Jesus by his followers, the total humiliation and rejection. I know that. But why is Peter denying Jesus here? From an internal standpoint, what's the thought process that's going on in his mind? He's an outspoken, the most outspoken disciple up to this point. He becomes the most outspoken disciple later as well, too. But he's the most outspoken disciple at this point. He's gone to such an extent as to cut off the ear of a servant of the high priest. He has to remember that Jesus has predicted that he would deny him. So why does he fall to this temptation? I think there are several things that we can point to. These are not valid excuses. These are just excuses. For one thing, Peter was not used to the presence of the high priest's officials and guards. He was not the one that was led into the courtyard on his own merit. John was. John more comfortable in that situation because there's people that he knows. You've been in situations where you've walked into a room and you didn't know anybody. How uncomfortable is that? It's incredibly uncomfortable. It's incredibly intimidating. And you find yourself trying to find any little bit of common ground with other people to have a conversation with them. So Peter is in an intimidating and unfamiliar environment, thus heightening his fear. Secondly, what has Peter just done hours before? He's committed a crime against the high priest's servant. Now, Jesus healed Malchus, although John doesn't record that Jesus healed Malchus. But Peter at this moment may not be totally clear that he's going to get off with that. So an already intimidating and frightful situation, there's another layer of potential anxiety that goes along with it. What if Malchus says, that guy struck me with his ear, and he gets brought in? Still, not a good excuse, but an excuse nonetheless. He doesn't want to be seen at this moment if he thinks himself to be vulnerable to arrest, to be seen as a sympathizer with the high priest's enemy number one. The fact is, though, we don't really know Peter's rationality. There had to be some rationale. There had to be something that went on in his brain in that moment when the servant asks, "Are you not also one of them?" Where he says, "No." But this is the beginning of Peter's spiritual and relational descent. The interesting note in verse 18 about the fire. The detail of the fire is also reported in Mark's gospel and Luke's gospel, and it suggests an eyewitness. Now, John, if John is the other disciple, I think he is, John is an eyewitness. He would have known there was a fire. If in Mark's gospel, you know who Mark's primary source was? Mark was not a disciple himself, but who was Mark's primary source? More than likely, Peter. And Peter, obviously, an eyewitness. Luke, we believe, took his information from both Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel, so it would have been a secondary kind of witness account, but Luke, being a historian, would have paid attention to such details. Only John adds a tiniest little kind of wrinkle to this fire. He's the only one that says it was a charcoal fire. Now, why is that detail important? It's not super important, but it is interesting. Because this word is kind of an odd word. It's not used all that often, but John uses it twice. Uses it here, and can you guess, anyone want to hazard a guess at where the other place is? Post-resurrection breakfast on the beach, where Peter is reinstated, restored. It's a charcoal fire that Jesus uses to cook breakfast for them. So there's this kind of interesting, and because John is so attentive to the literary detail, he bookends the first denial of Peter with his ultimate restoration with this charcoal fire scene. I find that stuff incredibly interesting. I don't know if you do, but I think that's, because it demonstrates that there's a literary sequence that goes on in the mind of John. It also is confirmation that the preliminary proceedings against Jesus took place at night when it was cold, and the servants and the officials made a fire to keep warm. This is an exceedingly unlikely thing to happen in the daytime, especially during the Passover season. Night proceedings, such as this one, were considered illegal because they're not done in the open. They're not done in the light where everyone could see. Also, making us remember the beginning of John's gospel when he talks about the light has shone in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it or overcome it. So we're getting the darkness trying to overcome the light, and we're seeing the effects. It's an ominous scene because ominous things are happening. John is painting that picture very well. From there, we're outside at the fire, Peter's denial. Now we move inside and the interrogation by the high priest. Verse 19. Yeah, we got time for this. The high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. We'll stop there. Just one verse. Most certainly this is Annas that's asking the questions. He's the one that is talking to Jesus directly. He would have been the most senior member of the family. And he's the one that's recognized by the Jewish people as the high priest. Whether Caiaphas was recognized by the Romans or not, it's irrelevant. But the questions that Annas poses, it's not just one question, it's multitudes of questions, but they focus on two areas. The first is the disciples, not specifically the 12 apostles. This is about the size of Jesus' company. This is about the nature and the makeup. Has Jesus gained disciples amongst some of the temple guards? Has Jesus gained disciples amongst some of the Roman guards? What type of disciples does he have? What are their numbers? He's trying to figure all of these things out to determine Jesus' popularity and the distance of his influence. If you look at John chapter 11, verse 48, this is one of the chief concerns of the religious authorities. See, they say, the whole world has gone after him. They're very concerned about Jesus and his popularity. It's a very political question because one of the things that the high priests are concerned about is their own position and place with the Roman government. If they are seen to be harboring a known rebel of the Roman government, if they're seen to be sympathetic or lenient on a known military rebel of the Roman Empire, they could lose they know all it takes is a snap of the Caesar's fingers to bring in the entire armies of the Roman Empire and lay waste to Jerusalem. If they don't know it, they find out real quick in 70 AD because that's exactly what happens. just a few years later, just a couple decades later. So one case, they're trying to determine Jesus' popularity. This is something they certainly would have emphasized amongst Pilate and the other Roman officials. The other concern was theological. What was Jesus teaching? This is the rationale they give for crucifying Jesus. They cannot give the rationale to the Jewish people that they're going to kill someone because he's a popular religious leader if he's teaching the right things. That would not have held water. In fact, it probably would have backfired. So they have to question him about his teaching. What is he teaching them? And ultimately, that's what they accuse him of, blasphemy, a punishable offense by death. His teaching, they have to contend, is false. And he's leading large numbers of people astray, leading them to ultimately overthrow the Roman government. This is the case that they're trying to build. Now, the fact that Annas is questioning Jesus directly confirms that this is not part of the trial itself, but it's rather more like a police interrogation, kind of a pre-trial interrogation to see if they're going to indict him. Now, they know they're already going to indict him, but they have to go through the motions. Because in a typical trial, even in the Jewish system, the accused is not formally questioned. They have to bring witnesses and evidence against the accused. It's not that different than our trial system. Most of the time, the accused is not brought to the witness stand. Sometimes they are, but not very often. That would have been the case here. So Jesus' question about his disciples and about his teaching, and then Jesus responds in this way. Verse 20. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. They know what I said. Now, Jesus says nothing to protect himself. He's not trying to protect himself. He's simply, really what he's doing is he's asking for a fair trial so that all the people might bear witness to what is going on. Again, he's not trying to defend himself. He's not trying to defend himself or put his disciples at risk. He's simply asking for a fair trial. Now, when Jesus says, I've spoken openly to the world, I've always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, does that mean he never taught anything in private? No, we know that's not true. We just spent like 3 chapters looking at how Jesus taught his disciples in private. But what he taught them in private, he also taught publicly. Anything he taught in private with his disciples was merely explanation or expansion on what was taught publicly. This would be not very much dissimilar to how we think of public preaching versus private teaching. It's like small groups versus, it's not that those two things contradict each other. In fact, we hope that they never contradict each other, but it's more of an explanation of what is taught publicly. What Jesus is saying here is that he's been in the public arena. He's been available. He's been available to be heard. In fact, the high priest and the religious officials, they have heard him teach. And what Jesus is saying to them is, you can call witnesses, but really, you've heard me teach. I've been in the temple. I've been in the places where the religious authorities are. He's not tried to hide. He's not tried to run. He's been available all along. His abiding presence with his believers has sustained them and will continue to sustain them. But the author insists that the teaching of Jesus must be attended to very specifically. As Jesus makes this answer, in verse 22, there's a response from a high priest's official. It says, when he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, is that how you answer the high priest? Verse 23, Jesus said, if what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? So Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. This is the first record in John's gospel of violence done to Jesus. This is the first time someone strikes him. This is the beginning of the physical descent. Some minor official in the high priest's court takes umbrage with Jesus' challenge and slaps him in the face. It's a blow, the Greek, a blow with the flat of the hand on the face. And Jesus does not back down. He doesn't cower. He just says, what did I say? That was wrong. If his response to the high priest was illegal or inappropriate, then fine. Strike him. But if it's appropriate, then charges should be filed against him on the basis of the witnesses, on the basis of the evidence, not based on this kangaroo trial. Some people look at this and they compare it to another moment in which a spiritual Christian leader is slapped in the face, and that's the Apostle Paul. In Acts chapter 23, verses 2 through 5, the Apostle Paul was struck for challenging the high priest. That was in the course of a formal session of the Sanhedrin. Paul, in that moment, different than Jesus, apologizes. We say, well, wait a minute. Why does Paul apologize and Jesus doesn't? Well, in the case of Paul, Paul actually insulted the high priest. He actually calls him a whitewashed wall. Basically, he says he's a hypocrite, a dirty piece of work daubed with whitewash to preserve the appearances. So, Paul apologizes because that's a violation of the scripture to insult the high priest, to speak evil of a ruler in authority. But Jesus doesn't do that. Notice Jesus does not in any way, shape, or form insult the high priest. He simply says, why are you asking me? There are other people, including, he doesn't say this, parenthetically, people in that room, who could have testified to what Jesus said. Jesus was not acting in rebellion to the high priest's authority, but simply in rebellion to the methodology by which he is being interrogated. So there's no need for Jesus to apologize in this moment. Jesus doesn't, at this moment, even turn the other cheek, but simply asks the question, what have I done that's wrong? And the answer is nothing. That's where we're going to leave off today. Next week, we go back outside. Not physically us, but we're going to look at Peter's second denial. Will you join me in prayer? Gracious God, thank you so much for this day, for the work of your Son, Jesus Christ, the life of Jesus Christ, born in humility, raised perfectly without blemish, without sin, that he might die sacrificially for our sakes. Help us always with gratitude to respond by sharing with others the good news of Jesus Christ. Pray this in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen. All right, guys, we'll see you later.